The haunting ride of Oliver and Sophia. You're on an empty highway, no streetlights, no signs of life. Just you, your vehicle, and the black void stretching endlessly ahead. The hum of your engine is the only sound keeping you grounded, but even that seems distant, as though the night itself is swallowing it whole. The clock on the dashboard reads 3:33 a.m. The witching hour. The world feels different at this time. The kind of different that prickles at the back of your neck. The kind that makes you double-check your locks even though you know you're alone. The night presses in, heavy and cold, suffocating. The air outside is cold, biting, pressing against the glass like an unseen force waiting to creep in. Your headlights barely pierce the darkness, as if the night itself is devouring the light. The road feels different now, doesn't it? A little too empty, a little too quiet, a little too wrong. That's when you see it. A figure, small and frail, barely visible in the gloom, walking along the edge of the road, swaying slightly as though the darkness itself is dragging it down. You grip the steering wheel tighter. Your first thought is to slow down, but something in your gut tightens, urging you to keep going. Don't stop, it whispers. Don't look too long. But then the figure stumbles, just a child, alone, lost, in the middle of nowhere, at this ungodly hour. You fight the instinct to drive past, telling yourself it's the right thing to do. You're human after all. Compassion is what separates us from the monsters, isn't it? Your hand trembles as it reaches for the steering wheel, guiding your car to the shoulder. The crunch of gravel under your tires sounds like bones breaking. Oliver had never been much for celebrating birthdays. Not because he didn't care. Quite the opposite. It was just that life had a way of keeping him too busy. Long-haul trucking was demanding, and after his wife Michelle passed away, it was just him and Sophia. He worked tirelessly to provide for her, to make sure she had everything she needed, even if it meant missing out on the little things. But Sophia's 10th birthday was different. She had begged him for weeks to let her come along on his route. "Just this once, Dad," she'd pleaded, her wide eyes filled with excitement. Oliver had finally caved, unable to resist her enthusiasm. He promised himself he'd make it a day she'd never forget. The morning had started with a special breakfast at home, a rare treat for them both. Pancakes, bacon, and her favorite, chocolate milk. Sophia giggled as she sat at their small kitchen table, her feet swinging back and forth. Oliver watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She was growing up so fast, but in moments like this, she was still his little girl. By mid-morning, they were on the road. The truck's cab was their shared space, filled with her laughter and chatter. She marveled at the massive steering wheel and the rows of dials and switches, calling it their adventure mobile. Oliver couldn't help but laugh at her excitement, a sound that hadn't come easily for him in years. They made a stop at a cozy diner around lunchtime, the kind of place where the waitresses called you hun, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. Oliver had prearranged for a small cake to be brought to their table, a single candle flickering as the staff and other patrons joined in singing "Happy Birthday." Sophia's cheeks flushed with joy as she blew out the candle, her eyes shining brighter than the flame. Later, at a small general store along the road, Oliver let Sophia pick out a couple of tiny gifts. She chose a keychain shaped like a truck and a colorful beaded bracelet. "To remember this day forever," she said with a grin. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape, they settled back into the truck, their bellies full, their hearts light. Sophia unwrapped the keychain and clipped it onto the zipper of her small backpack, proudly showing it to her dad. "See? Now it's like I'm part of your trucking crew," she said. "You've always been my co-pilot, kiddo," Oliver replied, glancing at her with a rare, genuine smile. But as the night deepened, so did the quiet. The laughter and chatter that had filled the cab throughout the day began to fade. Sophia grew sleepy, her head resting against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Oliver adjusted the heater, trying to keep her warm as the temperature outside dropped. The road stretched out endlessly before them, dark and empty. Only the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the trailer broke the silence. Oliver glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. They were running behind schedule, but he didn't mind. This trip wasn't about the destination. "I'll find us a place to stop soon," he said softly, though Sophia was already half asleep. The highway seemed to stretch forever into the night, the familiar comfort of the day now replaced by an unshakable stillness. The glow of the dashboard lights illuminated Oliver's face as he gripped the wheel, his mind wandering. He thought about how much Sophia had changed in the years since Michelle's passing, how resilient she was despite everything. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the sense that the night felt different, heavy somehow, as though the darkness itself was watching, waiting. Oliver eased his foot off the gas, the truck rolling to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The crunch of the tires seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield at the small figure barely visible in the darkness. It was a child, a girl no older than 10, her thin black dress clinging to her small frame. Her stringy hair hung in wet clumps around her face, though the air was dry and the road had seen no rain. Oliver frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. He glanced at Sophia, who was now wide awake, craning her neck to see. "Stay in your seat," he murmured, though his voice betrayed his unease. Rolling down the window, he called out, "Hey there, are you all right?" The girl didn't respond at first. She just stood there, her bare feet shifting slightly on the gravel, her head tilted ever so slightly, as if she were listening for something. "Are you lost?" Oliver tried again, louder this time. Slowly the girl stepped closer. Her movements were strange, halting as though her body wasn't quite her own. The closer she got, the more Oliver's unease deepened. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent under the harsh glare of the headlights, and her eyes, they were large, dark, and devoid of the sparkle he'd expect from a child. I'm lost," she whispered finally, her voice so faint it barely carried over the hum of the idling truck. She wrapped her thin arms around herself, shivering visibly. "I can't find my friends." Sophia's gasp broke the silence. "Dad, we can't leave her out here. She's just a kid." Her voice was tinged with urgency, and she had already begun unbuckling her seatbelt. Oliver hesitated, glancing back at the girl. His instincts screamed at him that something wasn't right. Her face, her voice, the way she moved. It all felt wrong, like a picture slightly out of focus. But then he saw the desperation in Sophia's eyes, and his resolve faltered. He sighed heavily, pushing down the unease tightening in his chest. "All right," he said gruffly, forcing his voice to stay calm. "We'll take you to the nearest station." The girl nodded but didn't smile or thank him. She just shuffled toward the truck, her head still tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Oliver glanced in the rearview mirror as she climbed in, her small frame barely making a dent in the back seat. Sophia turned to face her immediately, her natural curiosity taking over. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice soft but eager. The girl paused, her thin fingers twitching in her lap. "Emily," she said finally, her voice almost robotic. Sophia smiled warmly. "I'm Sophia. Don't worry, Emily. We'll get you somewhere safe." Emily didn't respond, her gaze fixed downward. Oliver adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look at her. She sat unnaturally still, her hands clasped tightly together as though she were trying to keep them from shaking. Her wet hair clung to her face, and her bare feet dangled above the floor mat. "What happened to your friends?" Oliver asked cautiously, keeping his eyes on the road as he pulled back onto the highway. Emily hesitated again, and for a moment Oliver thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a low, halting voice, she said, "We were playing hide and seek in the woods. I couldn't find them. And then they were just gone." Sophia's eyes widened. "That's awful. How long have you been out here?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slightly, her gaze shifting to the window, as though something outside had caught her attention. Oliver followed her gaze but saw nothing, just the endless stretch of highway disappearing into the darkness. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles whitening. The air in the cab felt heavier now, colder somehow, despite the heater blowing softly. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like they weren't alone anymore, like the darkness outside was pressing in closer with every passing mile. Sophia reached out to touch Emily's arm, but Oliver's voice cut through the silence. Sophia, sit back and buckle up, he said firmly. But Dad, now. Sophia obeyed reluctantly, her brows furrowing as she settled back into her seat. Emily finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for stopping. Oliver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw something strange, a flicker in her expression, like a mask slipping. But when he blinked, her face was as still and blank as before. As the truck rumbled on, Oliver couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. The hum of the engine, once comforting, now felt oppressive in the stifling silence. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing as he observed Emily. She sat motionless, her small frame oddly rigid. Her hair obscured much of her face, but her head seemed to tilt slightly, as if listening to something. Oliver's eyes darted back to the road, his fingers gripping the wheel tighter. So, Emily, he said, breaking the tension, where are your parents? The girl didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, like a faint echo. They're not here. Oliver frowned. Not here? Where are they then? Emily didn't respond. Instead, her gaze shifted to the window, her face eerily calm as she stared into the impenetrable darkness outside. Sophia, always the chatterbox, leaned closer to Emily, her curiosity overcoming any sense of fear. Did you run away? Is that why you were out there all alone? She asked softly. Emily turned her head slightly, her hair parting enough to reveal her pale, expressionless face. I was playing with my friends, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. And they just left you? Sophia pressed, her brows furrowing. They disappeared, Emily said flatly, her words sending a chill down Oliver's spine. Disappeared? What do you mean? Sophia asked, leaning even closer. Emily's eyes flicked to Sophia then, her gaze unsettlingly intense. One by one, she said simply. Sophia blinked, clearly unnerved but trying to hide it. She sat back in her seat, stealing a glance at her father. Oliver forced himself to stay calm, though his instincts were screaming at him that something wasn't right. The air in the truck had grown colder, noticeably so. He reached out to adjust the heater, but it was already on full blast. A faint chill brushed against his neck, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. You cold back there? He asked, his voice gruff. No, Emily replied immediately, her voice so quiet it almost blended with the hum of the engine. Oliver glanced at the rearview mirror again, his unease deepening. Emily's reflection seemed strange. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was almost as if her outline didn't match her physical form, like a faint distortion in a poorly tuned television. He shook his head, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then there was the humming. It started softly, so faint he almost didn't notice. A strange, haunting tune that seemed to vibrate through the air. Oliver thought it was coming from Emily at first, but then he realized Sophia was humming too. Sophia, he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She jumped slightly, startled. What? What are you humming? She frowned as if confused by the question. I don't know, it's stuck in my head. Oliver's stomach tightened. He glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror. She was humming too, softly, almost imperceptibly, but her lips weren't moving. Where'd you hear it? He pressed, his voice tense. Sophia shrugged. I think Emily was humming it first, she said, her tone casual, as if this were normal. Oliver's pulse quickened. He glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. The time seemed to crawl, each minute dragging longer than the last. He adjusted the radio, hoping for some static to drown out the unsettling tune, but the dial only spun in vain. The silence in the truck grew heavier, oppressive. The windows fogged slightly despite the heater. Oliver wiped at the glass with his sleeve, but the faint smears of condensation returned almost instantly. Dad, look! Sophia suddenly exclaimed, pointing out the window. Oliver's heart leapt as he scanned the darkness, but he saw nothing, just the endless stretch of road and the encroaching blackness. What is it? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophia hesitated, her hand lowering slowly. I thought I saw someone, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Walking by the road. Oliver's grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenching. He kept his eyes on the road, but his peripheral vision caught something strange. A faint shadow seemed to flicker just beyond the reach of the headlights. He blinked, and it was gone. "You're just tired," he muttered, more to himself than to Sophia. But in the back seat, Emily smiled faintly, her expression hidden from Sophia. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that seemed to know far more than it should. Oliver adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his hands clammy despite the cold air filling the truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, his eyes narrowing. Emily's reflection, it wasn't right. Her face seemed slightly distorted, as if seen through warped glass. Her mouth stretched wider than it should, her lips curling into a faint, unnatural grin. But what unsettled him most were her eyes, two black voids that stared back at him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. Oliver quickly turned his head to look at her directly. She was sitting perfectly still, her face obscured by the shadows of the dim truck interior. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, but his gut told him otherwise. "Dad!" Sophia's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. Oliver glanced at her, his heart skipping a beat. She looked pale, her small hands clutching her temples. "My head hurts," she murmured. "What kind of hurt?" Oliver asked, his voice laced with concern. "It feels heavy," she said, her words slow and slurred. Oliver reached over to touch her forehead. Her skin was freezing, as if she had been standing outside in the dead of winter. He frowned, his pulse quickening. "We're stopping," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. As he slowed the truck, a deep, guttural sound emanated from somewhere beneath the vehicle. It wasn't the engine, it was something else entirely. A low rumble that seemed to reverberate through the cabin. The headlights began to flicker violently, their light pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Each flicker illuminated the road ahead for only a fraction of a second, and in one of those brief flashes, Oliver swore he saw something. A figure standing motionless in the middle of the road. He slammed the brakes, his heart pounding. The truck screeched to a halt, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires deafening in the silence of the night. And then, darkness. The headlights went out entirely, plunging them into a void so complete it felt suffocating. Even the engine died, leaving only the oppressive quiet. Oliver's breath came in a shallow gasp as he fumbled for the keys, trying to restart the truck. "Dad," Sophia whispered again, her voice trembling. "It's okay," Oliver said quickly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. His hand shook as he turned the key, but the engine didn't respond. In the rearview mirror, Emily's reflection moved. Oliver froze. He hadn't seen her move, not directly, but in the mirror, her head tilted slightly to one side, her hair parting just enough to reveal a glimpse of that unnatural smile. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Emily?" Oliver said cautiously, his voice barely steady. She didn't answer. Suddenly, Sophia let out a sharp cry, clutching her head tightly as tears streamed down her face. "It hurts!" she screamed, her voice raw with pain. Oliver turned to her, panic taking over. "Sophia, look at me!" But her eyes were unfocused, staring past him as if she were looking at something, or someone, he couldn't see. "She's here," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Oliver's blood ran cold. "Who's here?" Before she could answer, a sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. Oliver turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound was coming from the passenger side window. But when he looked, there was nothing there. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing inside the cabin as if coming from every direction at once. Oliver's breathing quickened as he scanned the darkness, his eyes darting to every shadow. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver turned back to the rearview mirror, his hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Emily's reflection was gone. He twisted in his seat to look directly at her, but she was still there, sitting perfectly still, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I want to get out," she said suddenly, her voice sharp and commanding. Oliver blinked, startled. What? I want to get out, she repeated, her tone colder now. We're in the middle of nowhere, Oliver said, trying to keep his voice calm. It's not safe. Let me out, Emily shouted, her voice reverberating unnaturally in the confined space. Sophia screamed again, collapsing against the seat. Oliver's heart felt like it might burst as he reached for her, his mind racing. But before he could do anything, the truck's interior was flooded with whispers, low, incomprehensible murmurs that seemed to come from the very walls of the vehicle. Oliver's eyes darted around frantically, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, in the corner of his vision, he saw it. Emily was smiling. But it wasn't a child's smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, stretching across her face like a gash. Her eyes, now fully black, gleamed in the faint light. She leaned forward slightly, her head tilting as she whispered one chilling word. Run. Oliver's hands trembled as he guided the truck into the rest area, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The lot was empty, the silence broken only by the soft ticking of the cooling engine as it came to a stop. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, struggling to steady his breathing. We'll stop here for a minute, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Sophia didn't respond. She slumped in her seat, her small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent hue, and her eyes fluttered as if she were fighting to stay conscious. Oliver reached out to her. Sophia? Baby, can you hear me? Before he could get an answer, Emily spoke. Why did we stop? Her voice was sharp, accusatory, carrying a weight far beyond her small frame. Oliver turned to her, his unease mounting. Sophia's not feeling well. I need to check on her. We shouldn't stop, Emily said, her tone flat, devoid of emotion. She leaned forward slightly, her hair falling away from her face to reveal a blank, expressionless stare. It's not safe, Oliver frowned. What are you talking about? We're at a rest area. We're fine. No, Emily said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. You're not. The words sent a shiver down Oliver's spine. He turned back to Sophia, placing a hand on her forehead. It was ice cold and her skin felt clammy under his touch. Suddenly, she let out a blood-curdling scream, her back arching violently. Sophia! Oliver shouted, panic taking over. He shook her gently, trying to rouse her, but she only screamed louder, clutching her head as if something inside it were trying to claw its way out. And then, the truck shifted. It wasn't a natural movement, not the sway of wind or weight redistribution. It felt deliberate, like something or someone had pushed it. Oliver froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The truck groaned again, tilting slightly as if an unseen force was testing its strength. Let me out, Emily said suddenly. Oliver whipped his head around to look at her. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but her voice carried a chilling authority. What? He asked, his voice shaky. I said let me out, Emily repeated, her tone sharper now. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Her face was partially illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights, and Oliver's breath caught in his throat. Her grin had stretched impossibly wide, curling up toward her ears, her teeth jagged and glinting unnaturally. Her eyes were no longer human. They were pure white, glowing faintly in the dim light. Get out, she hissed, her voice distorting, layered with something deeper, something inhuman. Oliver's instinct was to run, but Sophia's whimpers brought him back. He reached for her, desperate to protect her, but the truck's interior suddenly erupted with sound. Whispers filled the cabin, low and overlapping, growing louder and more frenzied. They came from everywhere, the vents, the dashboard, the very walls of the truck. Outside, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows. Shadowy figures appeared in the periphery, just beyond the glass. They stood motionless, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Oliver's chest tightened. What do you want? He demanded, his voice cracking. Emily turned her head slowly, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. I was never lost, she said, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos around her. I was waiting. Oliver's grip on Sophia tightened. Waiting for what? Emily's grin widened further, her face now a grotesque mask of malice. For you, she said, and for Sophia. The truck lurched again, harder this time, the entire frame shuddering. The shadows outside pressed closer, their forms more defined now. They had faces, twisted, hollow visages, with eyes that burned like embers. "Let us out," Emily said again, her voice a guttural growl that didn't belong to a child. Oliver's mind raced. He had to get out of there, had to get Sophia away from whatever this was. He reached for the keys, his hand trembling, but they wouldn't turn. "You can't run," Emily said, leaning closer to him. Her breath was cold against his cheek. "It's too late." Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes wide and glowing faintly, mirroring Emily's. She smiled, a small, unsettling smile that sent a jolt of terror through Oliver. "Daddy," she said, her voice hollow and unrecognizable. "She's here." Oliver's world tilted, the weight of her words sinking in. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the shadowy figures began to tap on the windows. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, each sound reverberating through the cabin like a countdown. Oliver had no choice. He had to act, even if it meant facing whatever horror awaited outside. With a deep breath, he reached for the door handle. But before he could pull it, Emily laughed, a chilling, echoing sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. "Go ahead," she said, her grin now impossibly wide. "Open the door. Let them in." Oliver's hands were trembling as he held Sophia, her small frame limp in his arms. Her head lolled to one side, her breathing faint and shallow. "Sophia, Sophia, wake up," he begged, shaking her gently. There was no response. Her lips were slightly parted, her skin unnaturally pale. Oliver could feel the faintest flutter of her pulse, but it was weak, far too weak. "You're wasting your time," Emily's voice rang out, cold and detached. Oliver's head snapped up, and his blood ran cold. Emily was no longer sitting in the back seat. Instead, she stood in the center of the truck's cabin, her form flickering like an old, damaged film reel. Her distorted grin stretched across her face, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. "What did you do to her?" Oliver demanded, his voice shaking with rage and fear. Emily tilted her head, her movements eerily slow and deliberate. "She's mine now," she said, her voice reverberating, layered with countless others. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around Oliver like a cacophony of despair. The shadows outside pressed closer, their forms solidifying into grotesque shapes. Clawed hands began scratching at the windows, leaving streaks of frost in their wake. "Give her back!" Oliver shouted, his voice cracking. Emily laughed, a high-pitched, chilling sound that seemed to echo endlessly. "You brought her here. You stopped for me. This was always going to happen." Oliver clutched Sophia tighter, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, desperate for any source of light, but the screen remained black no matter how many times he pressed the buttons. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the chaos ceased. The whispers stopped. The scratching vanished. The truck's interior was silent, save for Oliver's ragged breathing. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't stir. A cold wind swept through the truck, and Oliver turned to see that Emily was gone. There was no trace of her, no sound, no lingering shadow. Only the faint echo of her laughter, trailing off into the night. The truck's engine refused to turn over. Oliver tried again and again, but the vehicle was dead, stranded in the oppressive darkness. He sat there holding Sophia and staring into the void outside, too afraid to step out, too paralyzed to move. Hours passed before he saw headlights in the distance. A trucker pulled over, finding Oliver slumped over the wheel with Sophia still cradled in his arms. "Help her," Oliver croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Please." Sophia was rushed to the hospital, but she remained unresponsive, locked in a catatonic state. Doctors ran every test they could, but they found no medical explanation for her condition. Oliver stayed by her bedside for days, his guilt consuming him. He barely ate, barely slept, his mind replaying the events of that night over and over. And then one morning, she was gone. Her hospital bed was empty, the sheets neatly folded as though she had simply gotten up and walked away. Security footage showed nothing, no one entering or leaving her room. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Oliver's despair turned into obsession. He pored over maps, police reports, and old folklore, searching for any clue, any explanation. But his search yielded nothing. And then the calls began. It started with static, soft, barely noticeable, like the background hum of an old radio. But over time, the static grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers. Sometimes he could hear Sophia's voice, humming the eerie tune Emily had taught her. "Daddy," she whispered one night, her voice faint and distant. "I'm still here." Oliver thought he was making his daughter's birthday unforgettable. And he did, but in the worst way imaginable. Sophia is gone now, her voice lingering in the echoes of the night. And Emily? She's still out there, waiting for her next ride. So the next time you're driving alone on a dark, empty highway and you see a figure on the roadside, remember this story. Would you stop? Would you risk it? Either way, it might not matter, because once she's chosen you, there's no escape. If this story chilled you to the bone, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more terrifying tales. And tell us in the comments, would you have stopped for Emily? Story 2. The Boiling Curse. It began like so many other nights, a dark stretch of highway under a sky that seemed unnaturally empty. No stars, no moon, just the faint glow of Liam's headlights cutting through the void. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth from years of cross-country drives. But tonight, something felt different. The cab was unusually quiet, too quiet. Even the hum of the engine seemed muted, as though the night itself was swallowing the sound. Liam reached for the radio, hoping to drown out the unease creeping into his chest. But as his fingers turned the dial, all he found was static, a harsh, grating noise that sent a chill down his spine. He grunted, shaking his head. "Must be in a dead zone," he muttered, his voice unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by shadowy trees that seemed to close in with every passing mile. Liam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced at the rearview mirror out of instinct. Nothing. Just the dim glow of his tail lights and the impenetrable darkness beyond. Then out of nowhere, his headlights illuminated a sign on the roadside. It was weathered and barely legible, the paint peeling away with age. "Dinner ahead, open 24/7. Liam hadn't planned to stop, but something about that sign tugged at him, a strange pull, like an itch at the back of his mind. Maybe it was the thought of a hot coffee or the chance to stretch his legs, but before he realized it, he was slowing down, turning onto a narrow path that led to the diner. The building came into view, sitting alone in a clearing like a relic from another time. Its neon sign buzzed weakly, the word diner flickering intermittently. The parking lot was empty, save for a single rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Liam stepped out of his truck, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots unnervingly loud. The air felt heavy, like the weight of a storm that never came. He hesitated, glancing back at his truck, the cab still warm and inviting. For a brief moment he considered climbing back in and driving away. But then the faint scent of coffee reached him, rich and inviting, cutting through the cold night air. The door creaked loudly as he stepped inside, and immediately Liam was struck by how still everything was. The diner was eerily clean, every surface gleaming under the dim fluorescent lights. A jukebox in the corner sat silent, and the stools at the counter were perfectly aligned, as though no one had sat there in years. Behind the counter stood a woman, older, with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Her hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her apron was spotless. She didn't smile, but her gaze never left Liam as he approached. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice sharp but oddly melodic. Liam nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious under her stare. "Yeah, just a cup. Been on the road a while." The woman turned without another word, pouring the coffee with a precision that felt unnatural. She placed the cup in front of him, and as he reached for his wallet, she raised a hand. "It's on the house," she said, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "A tradition for travelers passing through." Liam hesitated. There was something about her tone, something that made his skin crawl. But the coffee smelled too good to resist, and his fatigue outweighed his instincts. He lifted the cup to his lips, the warmth spreading through his hands. "Thanks," he muttered, taking a sip. The coffee was rich and smooth, almost too perfect. The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer before she turned away, disappearing through a door marked "Staff Only." Liam finished the coffee quickly, eager to get back on the road. But as he stood to leave, he felt something on his arm. An itch, faint at first, but growing more intense with every second. He scratched absent-mindedly, brushing it off as nothing. But as he climbed back into his truck, the whispers began. Faint, just barely audible over the rumble of the engine. A voice, or maybe several, murmuring words he couldn't quite understand. He glanced around, his heart racing, but there was no one. The parking lot was empty. The diner's neon sign flickered behind him, casting strange shadows on the ground. Liam shook his head, gripping the wheel tightly, pulling back onto the highway. But as the truck gained speed, the whispers grew louder, and the itch on his arm became something much worse. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the dark asphalt shimmering faintly under Liam's headlights. The coffee, which had tasted so smooth, now left an odd metallic tang lingering in his mouth. He reached for a bottle of water from the cup holder, hoping to wash it away, but his hand froze midair. That itch on his arm, it wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It burned now, a fiery sensation crawling just beneath the skin. He glanced down, expecting to see a simple rash, but what he saw made his stomach lurch. A small boil had formed, red and angry, its surface glistening as though it were alive. Liam swore under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He flexed his fingers, trying to shake off the discomfort, but the boil throbbed in response, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The radio, which had been silent since he left the diner, crackled suddenly, the static loud and jarring. He reached out to turn it off, but before his fingers could touch the dial, a voice broke through. Liam. His name, clear as day, spoken in a voice that wasn't his own. His breath hitched as he stared at the radio, now silent again. He shook his head, laughing nervously to himself. "You're losing it," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just a long night. Too much caffeine." But the unease refused to leave him. The shadows on the roadside seemed to shift and move, twisting into shapes that disappeared when he looked directly at them. The headlights flickered once, twice before stabilizing, casting their weak glow onto the empty road ahead. As he drove, the whispers returned, faint at first, like wind slipping through a crack. But soon they grew louder, overlapping and blending into an eerie cacophony. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, taunting, as though the voices knew something he didn't. Liam's hand instinctively went to the boil on his arm. It had grown larger, its surface now stretched tight and glistening under the dim interior light. He could feel it, the way it pulsed and writhed beneath his skin. A deep primal fear began to take hold, spreading through him like wildfire. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:17 a.m. The numbers seemed to flicker for a moment before stabilizing. His breathing quickened as the realization dawned. This wasn't just exhaustion or paranoia. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain. The road ahead suddenly felt narrower, the trees on either side closing in like the walls of a tunnel. Liam's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the back of the cab, a fleeting shadow that vanished as soon as he turned his head. "Pull yourself together," he said aloud, his voice trembling. But even as he tried to convince himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. The highway, once a lifeline of routine and familiarity, now felt like an endless corridor of dread. The silence outside was suffocating, pressing against the truck's windows like an invisible force. Inside, the whispers had stopped, but their absence felt worse, like the calm before a storm. Liam's arm throbbed again, pulling his attention from the road. The boil had grown even larger, its edges angry and raw. He prodded it gently with his fingertips, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his arm. To his horror, the surface of the boil quivered, as though something underneath was trying to push its way out. He quickly looked away, forcing himself to focus on the road. His truck, his sanctuary, now felt foreign, the familiar hum of the engine taking on a strange, almost mournful tone. The headlights flickered again, their weak beams illuminating the thick darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond their reach. And then it happened. A figure darted across the road. Liam slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the truck skidded to a halt. His heart pounded as he leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. There was nothing there. No movement, no figure. Just the empty road stretching out before him. "It's just your mind playing tricks," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his palms slick with sweat. But as he prepared to press the accelerator, something caught his eye. A handprint on the windshield. It was faint, barely visible against the glass, but unmistakable. The hand was too small to be his own, its long, spindly fingers leaving streaks that trailed downward, as if the hand had been dragged away. Liam's breathing quickened as he scanned the cab, his eyes darting to the mirrors and shadows. He reached for his phone, hoping to use its flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The screen remained dark, a reflection of the growing void in his chest. The whispers returned. They were louder now, coming from all directions, surrounding him like a swarm. His name was clearer this time, repeated over and over, each voice overlapping the last. "Liam! Liam! Liam!" He slapped the radio in frustration, but it wasn't the source of the sound. The voices were inside the cab, slithering through the air like a living thing. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. Maybe he just needed fresh air, a moment to collect himself. But when he tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, but it was as though the handle had fused to the frame. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The truck's headlights flickered violently before going out completely, leaving him in darkness. He was left with only the faint glow of the dashboard, its green numbers distorted and shifting like a mirage. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the silence returned. The handprint on the windshield was gone. The whispers had ceased. The door, when he tried it again, opened easily, swinging outward with a soft creak. The cold night air rushed in, biting at his skin. Liam stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He scanned the area, his eyes straining to make sense of the shadows. The road was deserted, the trees standing silent and motionless. He leaned against the truck, breathing heavily. His arms still throbbed, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it. Instead, he focused on the horizon, the faint line where the earth met the sky. But then he heard it, a soft, wet sound coming from the rear of the truck. Reluctantly, he stepped toward the noise, his boots feeling heavier with each step. As he rounded the back of the trailer, his breath caught in his throat. There, smeared across the metal door, was a single word, written in a dark, viscous liquid. "Pay!" The liquid dripped slowly, pooling at his feet. Liam staggered backward, his mind racing. He had to get away. He had to keep driving. But as he turned to climb back into the cab, he saw it, his reflection in the side mirror. It wasn't his face staring back at him. The eyes were hollow, the skin marred by boils that covered every inch. The reflection grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. Liam stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their mocking laughter echoing in his ears. He scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The engine roared to life as he turned the key, and the headlights blazed against the darkness. He pressed the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was happening. But deep down he knew there was no escaping this. Whatever had taken hold of him wasn't just on the outside. It was inside, spreading like wildfire, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truck hurtled down the highway, the roar of the engine a futile attempt to drown out the whispers. They were inside Liam's head now, relentless and invasive, weaving cryptic messages into his thoughts. His grip on the wheel was so tight that his knuckles had turned white, but he couldn't stop. He had to outrun whatever this was, even if he wasn't sure it was possible. The boils on his arm had multiplied. They now spread across his forearm and up toward his shoulder, each one pulsating as though alive. He tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the road ahead, but the pain was unbearable. With one hand on the wheel, he reached over to roll up his sleeve, his breath hitching at what he saw. The boils weren't just growing, they were moving. The flesh around them rippled as though something beneath the surface was writhing, trying to break free. He clenched his jaw, suppressing the urge to scream, his vision blurring with tears. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made him jump. And then came the voice. "You took what wasn't yours, Liam." His name spilled from the speakers, warped and layered, as if a dozen voices were speaking in unison. He instinctively reached out to turn the dial, but the voice persisted, growing louder. "You ignored the warnings? And now, you'll pay the price." The truck shuddered violently, the steering wheel jerking in his hands. Liam struggled to keep control as the headlights flickered again, their beams cutting through a dense fog that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. The road ahead was barely visible, the white lines vanishing into the mist. And then he saw them, figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. At first, he thought they were people, hitchhikers maybe. But as the truck drew closer, the shapes didn't move. They stood perfectly still, their forms unnaturally tall and thin. No faces, no features, just outlines against the fog. Liam's chest tightened as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles trembling. He tried to veer around them, but the figures multiplied, appearing on both sides of the road and closing in on the truck. The engine groaned as though it were alive, protesting against his attempts to accelerate. The truck slowed despite his foot pressing hard on the gas pedal, the figures drawing closer with every passing second. A sudden pain shot through his arm, more intense than anything he'd felt before. He screamed, clutching at his bicep as one of the boils burst open. Dark, viscous fluid oozed from the wound, spilling onto the seat and filling the cab with a sickly, metallic stench. He gagged, his stomach churning as the liquid began to writhe. It wasn't just oozing, it was moving. Tiny, wriggling shapes emerged from the fluid, crawling across his skin and onto the dashboard. Maggots, dozens of them, their pale, segmented bodies squirming in the dim light. He swatted at them in panic, his hand trembling as they seemed to multiply with every swipe. "Help me!" he shouted into the emptiness, his voice cracking. But there was no one to hear him. The figures outside the truck had stopped moving, their outlines blending into the fog. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. "It's too late, Liam." He turned to the passenger seat, his heart sinking as he saw it, a figure sitting there, shrouded in shadows. The same figure he'd glimpsed on the road earlier. It turned its head toward him slowly, its face hidden beneath a veil of darkness. "You should have left well enough alone," it rasped, its voice low and guttural. Liam's screams filled the cab as the truck began to slow on its own, the engine sputtering as though choking on air. The headlights dimmed, the dashboard flickered, and the truck rolled to a stop. And then the world outside went black. There was no road, no fog, no figures, just an infinite, suffocating void. The whispers ceased. The cab was silent except for Liam's ragged breathing and the faint, wet sound of his boils bursting one by one. He reached for the door, his hands slick with the dark fluid, but it wouldn't open. He was trapped. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the voice returned. "You didn't ask. You didn't think. Now you'll belong to us." The last thing Liam saw was his own reflection in the rearview mirror, his face consumed by boils, his eyes hollow and lifeless. And then, the truck's interior was flooded with blinding light, followed by a deafening silence. When the light faded, the truck was empty. The only sign of Liam's presence was a smear of dark liquid on the seat and the faint echo of his final scream. When Liam opened his eyes, he was no longer in the truck. The hard seat beneath him had been replaced by cold, uneven ground. The air around him was thick with decay, the smell so overpowering it made his stomach churn. He blinked against the darkness, his surroundings slowly coming into focus. He was back at the diner, but it wasn't the place he had stopped at earlier that night. The building was crumbling, the neon sign hanging crookedly above the entrance, its letters faintly flickering. The word welcome was incomplete, the W barely holding on to the frame. Liam staggered to his feet, his body aching. The boils on his arms throbbed, their grotesque shapes illuminated by the faint glow of the sign. He didn't want to go inside, but something, an unseen force, pulled at him, compelling him toward the door. The windows were caked with grime, but he could just make out shapes moving inside. Shadows flitted across the glass, their movements jerky and unnatural. A faint hum reached his ears, the sound low and monotonous, vibrating deep in his chest. He pushed open the door, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the diner was a ruin. Tables and chairs were overturned, the floor littered with shattered plates and broken glass. The air was heavy with dust, swirling in the faint light of a single flickering bulb. And yet, amidst the chaos, the counter stood intact, its surface gleaming as if freshly polished. Behind it stood the waitress, her piercing eyes locked onto Liam the moment he stepped inside. But something was different now. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones. Her smile was wide, unnaturally so, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. "You came back," she said, her voice dripping with malice. Liam's legs trembled, but he forced himself to speak. "What did you do to me?" The waitress tilted her head, her grin widening. "I gave you what you took. Isn't that fair?" "I didn't take anything," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty space. Her laughter was cold and hollow, filling the room like a chilling breeze. "Oh, but you did. That coffee? It wasn't yours to accept. You didn't ask. You didn't question. You just took." Liam's mind raced. The free coffee. It had seemed like such a harmless gesture, a small kindness in a long, grueling journey. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The waitress's expression darkened, her smile fading. "This place doesn't give without taking. It's always been that way. You're not the first, Liam, and you won't be the last." She stepped out from behind the counter, her movements fluid yet unnatural, as if her joints didn't quite work the way they should. "Do you know what happens to those who take without permission?" she asked, her tone almost playful. "They become part of the curse, part of this place." Liam stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "I don't understand." "You will," she interrupted, her voice sharp. She pointed to a photo hanging on the wall. It was old, the edges yellowed and curling. It showed a group of people standing in front of the diner, their faces solemn. And there, in the middle of the group, was the waitress, looking exactly as she did now. But it wasn't the photo that made Liam's blood run cold. It was the man standing next to her. It was him. His reflection stared back at him from the photograph, his face untouched by boils, his expression blank. He felt the room spin, his vision blurring as he stumbled toward the wall, his fingers brushing against the frame. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not me. That can't be me." The waitress laughed again, the sound reverberating through the diner. "You've always been here, Liam. You just didn't know it yet." As she spoke, the room began to shift. The walls melted into darkness, the floor dissolving beneath his feet. Liam tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. And then, the boils burst. Pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced tore through him as his skin split open, dark fluid spilling onto the ground. From the wounds crawled maggots, their writhing bodies consuming him, devouring him from the inside out. The waitress watched, her expression serene. "Welcome home, Liam." His screams echoed into the void as the darkness swallowed him whole. When the light returned, the diner was empty once more. The photo on the wall had changed. Liam's face was now frozen in the picture, his expression twisted in terror, his eyes pleading for help that would never come. Days passed and Liam's truck was discovered abandoned on the side of a long-forgotten road. A passing motorist spotted the massive rig, its hazard lights blinking faintly in the early dawn. The cab was eerily empty, as if Liam had simply vanished into thin air. On the windshield, a chilling message was scrawled in blood-red letters. "Don't drink what's offered in kindness." The letters dripped and glistened as though freshly painted, despite no sign of blood or anyone who could have written it. The locals whispered about the incident, the disappearance adding to the growing lore surrounding the diner. Search parties were organized, scouring miles of barren land for any sign of Liam. But there was nothing. No tracks, no belongings, no hint of where he could have gone. The truck, too, refused to cooperate. Mechanics who tried to start it found the engine dead. The wires melted as though burned from the inside. The air inside the cab was heavy, suffocating, carrying the faintest scent of decay. Those who dared to enter swore they heard whispers, soft, pleading voices calling Liam's name, along with the haunting hum of a tune no one could place. Back at the diner's supposed location, nothing remained. The building had vanished completely, replaced by a barren patch of dirt where no grass grew, as though the land itself had been scorched. But Liam's story didn't end there. Weeks later, a driver passing through the area reported something strange. On a quiet stretch of highway late at night, his radio crackled with static before tuning into a single voice. Liam's voice. "Don't stop! Don't stop for her!" it pleaded, breaking into sobs before the static returned. Others claimed to see a shadowy figure standing at the side of the road, a woman in a diner uniform with piercing eyes. She held a steaming cup of coffee, her lips twisted into a knowing smile. The brave or perhaps foolish drivers who pulled over to help never returned. But the most disturbing accounts came from truckers who noticed a strange pattern. Those who dared to look closely at old photographs of roadside diners often spotted something chilling. In the background, standing amidst smiling customers or busy staff, was a single figure, Liam. His expression was always the same, wide eyes filled with terror, his mouth open as if mid-scream, frozen in a torment that defied time. The photos surfaced in towns miles apart, spanning decades, yet each one bore the unmistakable mark of the cursed trucker. And then there were the phone calls. Families of truckers who went missing on that stretch of road began receiving calls late at night. The line would be filled with static, broken occasionally by faint whispers. Sometimes it was a hum, eerily similar to the tune that had haunted Liam in his final hours. Other times it was his voice. "Run," he would whisper. "She's coming." No one ever figured out who she was, but the warnings were always the same. Never stop for a stranger, never accept what's offered freely, and above all, never linger near the diner if you value your life. For those who ignored the warnings, their fate was sealed. Liam was gone, his life consumed by the boiling curse. But the curse itself, it lived on, spreading like a sickness to those unlucky enough to cross its path. So if you ever find yourself on a lonely stretch of highway and spot a figure at the side of the road holding a cup of coffee with a chilling smile, keep driving, because some acts of kindness come with a cost, one you might not survive to pay. Liam thought he was just another trucker passing through, another soul bound to the road, but the highway doesn't forget and it doesn't forgive. It watches, it listens, and sometimes it strikes. Now his story serves as a warning, etched into the minds of those brave enough to hear it. Would you have taken the coffee? These decisions seem small, insignificant in the moment. But as Liam learned, a single choice can be the difference between life and a fate far worse than death. And for those who believe it's just a story, just another tale to spook travelers on long, lonely nights, think again, because the next time you're out there, under the vast expanse of the night sky, you might feel it too. That chill running down your spine as you see a figure in the distance. The flicker of your headlights as they illuminate a diner that wasn't there before. The faint static on your radio, followed by a whisper that's just a little too familiar. If you find yourself in that moment, remember Liam's story. And whatever you do, don't stop. Don't take what's offered. Because once the curse finds you, there's no turning back. So would you survive the boiling curse? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of terror, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We've got more stories to tell, each one darker than the last. Until next time, stay safe out there and keep your eyes on the road, because you never know who or what might be watching. Story 3, The Sound of Silence. Ethan wasn't one for ghost stories. He was a practical man, his life ruled by schedules, maps, and mileage. A night shift trucker for over a decade, he had seen every stretch of road imaginable. His latest assignment was simple: deliver fragile medical supplies to a clinic nestled deep within a remote woodland town. The route was known for its isolation, thick, towering trees on either side, and a stretch of asphalt that ran uninterrupted for miles. No wildlife, no towns, just silence. At his last stop, a rundown gas station on the edge of the forest, a scruffy attendant leaned against the counter, his eyes shadowed with something like fear. As Ethan paid for his coffee, the man muttered, "If you hear a melody out there, keep driving. Don't stop, and don't listen." Ethan chuckled, assuming it was some local folklore to spook outsiders, but the man's hand trembled as he handed over the change, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm serious. Once you hear it, it's already too late." Ethan shrugged it off. Superstitions weren't his thing. He climbed back into his truck, reset his GPS, and rolled onto the black ribbon of highway that cut through the forest. As the miles ticked by, the silence wrapped around him like a second skin. No birds, no crickets, just the low rumble of his engine. It started faintly. At first, Ethan thought it was a mechanical issue, a soft, tinkling sound that seemed to blend with the hum of the truck. But as the minutes passed, it became clearer. A melody, delicate and haunting, like a music box playing a tune no one remembered. He glanced at his radio, but it was off. He rolled down his window, and the sound grew sharper, colder, like it was threading through the very air. He slowed the truck, peering into the trees. "Is someone out there?" he called, his voice sounding absurdly loud against the forest's oppressive quiet. The music stopped. The silence that followed felt alive, charged with an energy that prickled his skin. His GPS screen blinked, the route disappearing, replaced by the words, "Route unknown." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He tightened his grip on the wheel and muttered to himself, "Keep going. Just keep going." But as he shifted into gear, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement among the trees. A figure, small, indistinct, but unmistakably there. Standing perfectly still on the edge of the forest, its head tilted as though listening. Ethan's foot hovered over the gas pedal, and for a moment he considered speeding away, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. Against every instinct telling him to drive, he slowly brought the truck to a stop. The figure in the woods didn't move, didn't even blink. It was a shadow in the dark, just watching. Then, as if on cue, the melody started again. A soft, haunting lullaby that made his skin crawl. He knew he should keep driving, but his body seemed frozen, his eyes locked on the silhouette in the trees. For a moment, he wondered if it was a trick of the mind. Just the wind playing tricks. But when he glanced at the side mirror, his heart skipped a beat. The figure had come closer. A chill ran down Ethan's spine as the music grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the sound was no longer from a music box, but from the very forest itself. The trees seemed to sway, even though there wasn't a breeze. He looked around wildly, but there was nothing, just the dense, impenetrable woods pressing in on him. The truck sputtered. A faint crackle echoed from the engine. "Not now, come on, not now," Ethan muttered, his fingers tightening around the wheel. But the truck refused to start. The engine sputtered once more and died. He was stranded, sitting in a metal box surrounded by nothing but the dark and that relentless, eerie tune. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure had moved closer, its outline sharpening in the dim light. Ethan could now make out its features. Its head tilted unnaturally, its arms too long, almost like they had been stretched, hanging at its sides in an unsettling manner. The air felt thick, like a pressure was building all around him. And that's when the music inside the truck began. The soft, familiar melody of the music box. But it was coming from nowhere. The stereo was off. The radio static had died, yet the song played on, winding its way through the cab, twisting itself into Ethan's brain. He reached for the door handle, but his hand was trembling. The figure outside had stopped moving, standing unnervingly still. Its head turned toward the truck, its eyes, dark, hollow, focused on him. Ethan couldn't look away. He was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of whatever was out there. The music grew louder, more intense, until it felt like it was vibrating through his bones. It seemed to claw at his mind, each note making him dizzy, disoriented. He reached for his phone to call for help, but when he pressed the screen, the words on his GPS flickered again. "Route unknown." The phone buzzed once, then went silent. And then, the figure moved again. The figure glided forward too smoothly, like it wasn't walking but floating just above the ground. Ethan tried to start the engine once more, but it was no use. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind clouded by the dissonant hum of the melody. It wasn't just a tune anymore. It was something else, something ancient, resonating deep inside his chest. He could feel it vibrating through his very soul, calling to him. With each passing second, the figure in the trees drew closer. Ethan's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He knew he should run, but his legs wouldn't move. The music box melody grew louder, almost deafening now. And then a voice, soft, cold, distant, echoed in his mind. You shouldn't have listened. Ethan spun in his seat, eyes darting around the cab. No one was there. The voice was in his head. His fingers gripped the wheel, knuckles white with fear. The figure was only feet away now, its face emerging from the shadows. Ethan couldn't breathe. The face was wrong. A twisted, grotesque mask of human features, its eyes too wide, its mouth open in a grin that stretched too far. Its neck snapped at an impossible angle, and its arms, now impossibly long, reached toward the truck, its fingers brushing the window. A rush of cold swept over Ethan, and the truck's interior temperature dropped. He could see his breath fogging up in front of him, the air turning ice cold. The figure was closer now, so close he could hear the sound of its rasping breath, its voice becoming clearer, as though it was speaking directly into his ear. It's your turn to listen. The words, icy and twisted, shattered Ethan's mind. His vision blurred, and his body went numb. He didn't know how much time had passed before the music stopped. When it did, the silence was almost worse, heavy and suffocating. The figure's grin widened as it pressed its face against the glass. The last thing Ethan saw before the world went black was that smile, stretched impossibly wide, its teeth too sharp, its eyes too empty. When Ethan regained consciousness, he was no longer in the cab of his truck. He was in a clearing, surrounded by trees that looked ancient, twisted and blackened with rot. The music box melody had returned, though it was now distorted, warped and chaotic. It echoed all around him, pressing against his eardrums, making his mind feel as though it were being torn apart from the inside. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, like they were cemented to the ground. Panic surged through him, and with every ounce of strength, he fought to rise to his feet. The sound of crunching leaves beneath his boots echoed eerily in the quiet forest as he stumbled forward. The darkened clearing stretching endlessly before him. His heart raced. Sweat dripped down his brow. Where was he? What had happened to the truck? In the center of the clearing lay something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A broken music box, its lid askew. The same melody that had plagued him from the moment he entered this cursed forest spilled from its tiny speakers, repeating the same haunting tune. But what froze Ethan's blood was what surrounded it. Dozens of abandoned vehicles. Each one pristine, untouched by time, save for the thick layer of moss and vines that covered them. As he stumbled closer, his breath hitched. There were no drivers, no passengers, nothing but the cars left behind, standing as though they were part of the land itself. The vehicles were arranged in a perfect circle, like a ritualistic altar. Ethan's gaze swept over the collection, his eyes scanning each car for a sign of life, but there was nothing. That's when his eyes fell on the skeletal remains. The bodies were scattered on the ground around the music box, their skulls cracked open, their faces frozen in terror. The sight of their empty, hollow eyes staring at him sent a wave of nausea through his stomach. These were the victims. The ones who had heard the melody before him. The ones who had listened, just like he had. A cold hand touched his shoulder. Ethan whirled around, his heart hammering in his chest. Standing before him, towering over him like a shadow, was the same figure from earlier. The thing that had followed him. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, its eyes wide and vacant, staring down at him with an expression that was both haunting and hollow. The figure leaned forward, its face inches from Ethan's. It spoke, but the words weren't its own. They were the words of something far older, far darker. The voice was cold, like ice scraping across his spine. It's your turn to listen. And before Ethan could react, the figure reached out with a skeletal hand and touched his forehead. A jolt of coldness surged through his body, and with it came the horrible realization. The music box's melody wasn't just a song, it was a curse that fed on those who listened, who couldn't resist its call. Ethan's skin burned as the music started playing louder, too loud. His head throbbed with the pain of the tune, and his vision swirled as the curse took hold. His body began to tremble violently, and he fell to his knees, clutching his ears as though he could stop the noise. But it was no use. The music filled every part of him, drowning out everything else. The trees around him, the bodies, the figure, all faded into the background. The world spun around him. His skin began to feel like it was crawling off his bones. And as the agony grew unbearable, his body started to twist and change. He could feel his limbs contorting, his bones snapping, the muscles shifting in grotesque ways. The music box's tune pulsed through his veins like poison, making him feel as though his very soul was being torn apart. And then, nothing. The world fell silent. Ethan was no longer aware of his surroundings. He was lost to the melody, lost to the curse that had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. The forest seemed to swallow him whole, and the figure stood watching as the final victim of its haunting song vanished into the endless night.